The body was found at 6:47 in the morning by a man walking his dog along the Hudson River shoreline just north of the George Washington Bridge. The man's name was a retired postal worker with a heart condition and a German shepherd named Duke. Would later say he wished Duke had pulled him in any other direction that morning. The woman was face down in the shallow water, her left arm extended toward the shore as if she'd been reaching for something. She wore a cream-colored blouse, now transparent and clinging to her back, and dark slacks. One shoe was missing. Her hair fanned out in the current like seaweed. Called 911 at 6:51, the dispatcher asked if he was certain she was dead. He said yes, he was certain, because when he'd waded in to check her pulse, her skin had been cold as river stone and her eyes had been open, staring at the silt below. The dispatcher told him to move back to dry ground and wait for the police. Well, he did. Duke wouldn't stop barking at the tree line behind them, would mention this in his statement. Nobody asked him why. The responding officers were, and both from the 34th Precinct. They arrived at 7:03 and confirmed what already knew, waded into the water and checked for vitals while secured the perimeter with yellow tape, though there was no one around except a jogger who'd stopped to watch and then quickly moved on when waved him away. The woman's body was photographed where it lay, then pulled from the water at 7:34 by two officers in waders. They laid her on a plastic tarp. Her face was bloated but intact. No obvious trauma to the head, no ligature marks on the neck. Her fingernails were clean and unbroken. The missing shoe was never found. The medical examiner arrived at 8:12, a thin man named who'd been doing this work for 19 years and had the eyes of someone who'd learned not to see too much. He noted the body temperature, the rigor in the jaw and shoulders, the pooling in the lowest parts of her body. He estimated she'd been dead between 8 and 12 hours. That would place her death sometime between 7 p.m. and 11 p.m. the previous night. He also noted something else, something he wrote in his preliminary notes but didn't mention aloud to the officers. There was no water in her lungs. She hadn't drowned. Her name was Carver, 34 years old, a senior accountant at a mid-sized financial consulting firm in Midtown. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on West 181st Street, about 2 miles from where her body was found. She had no husband, no children, no criminal record. Her parents were both dead. She had a younger brother in Oregon who she spoke to maybe twice a year. Her described her as quiet, competent, and private. She arrived at work on time, ate lunch at her desk, and left at 5:30 most days. She didn't attend office parties. She didn't date anyone from the firm. One woman from accounting, Sandra, said had mentioned going to yoga classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, but Sandra couldn't remember which studio. Another, a man named, said he'd once seen at a wine bar in Washington Heights with another woman, but he hadn't approached them and didn't know who the woman was. That was the official version of Carver's life. The version her employer gave the police. The version that appeared in the initial news reports. A quiet woman, a private woman, a woman without complications. But if you looked even slightly closer, the image started to fracture. The first suspect was obvious. It's always obvious. 37, a bartender at a place called The Lantern on Amsterdam Avenue. He'd been seeing for 4 months, though seeing might be too generous a word. They met twice a week, usually at her apartment. He had a key. He told detectives they'd had an argument 2 nights before her body was found. He said it was about nothing, just stress, just one of those things. When pressed, he admitted she'd accused him of seeing someone else. He said she was wrong. He said he'd left her apartment around 9 that night and gone home. He lived in the Bronx alone in a studio apartment above a laundromat, no alibi, no witnesses. He said he'd been asleep. He seemed nervous when they questioned him, which meant nothing. Everyone seems nervous when questioned about a dead woman they used to sleep with. His phone records showed 3 calls to his number the night she died. 9:47 p.m., 10:13 p.m., 11:02 p.m. She didn't answer any of them. He said he was worried about her. He said he wanted to apologize. Detectives took his fingerprints, swabbed his hands for gunshot residue, just procedure, and let him go. They told him not to leave the city. Then there was 41, a personal trainer at an Equinox in Chelsea. Had been his client for 7 months. He told police she'd been coming in 3 times a week, working on core strength and cardio. He said she'd seemed distracted lately, maybe stressed. When detectives asked if their relationship had ever been anything other than professional, he hesitated just long enough for them to notice. He said no. He said he kept things professional with all his clients. But when they pulled his text messages, they found 17 exchanges with over the previous 3 weeks. Most were about scheduling, 3 were not. In one sent 9 days before her death had written, "I need to talk to you about something important, not at the gym." He'd responded, "My place Thursday." She'd replied, "Okay." Detectives asked him what they'd talked about. He said she'd been thinking about switching gyms, maybe finding a trainer closer to her apartment. They asked why she'd needed to discuss that at his apartment. He said he didn't know, she'd just asked. They asked what time she'd left. He said around 8. They asked if anyone had seen her leave. He said no, he lived alone. Another person with no alibi, another person with a reason to lie. But it was the third name that made things complicated. It came up almost by accident 3 days into the investigation when detectives were canvassing the building. Most of her neighbors barely knew her. She was the woman on the 4th floor who smiled politely in the elevator and never made noise. But one neighbor, an older woman named who lived directly below, mentioned something strange. She said that about 2 weeks ago, late at night, she'd heard voices, loud voices, a man and a woman arguing. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. She said it had lasted maybe 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. People argue. But then 3 days before his body was found, had seen a man leaving his apartment building at 11:30 p.m. She noticed because it was late and because the man had looked upset. She described him as tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair graying at the temples, wearing a long coat. She said she'd seen him before once or twice, always late at night. Detectives asked if it could have been the bartender. She said no, this man was older, more formal. They showed her a photo lineup. She pointed to the 5th photograph without hesitation. The man's name was Thomas Carver, his uncle. Thomas Carver was 62 years old, a semi-retired real estate attorney with an office on the Upper East Side and a co-op in Carnegie Hill. He'd been the executor of his parents' estate when they died in a car accident 11 years earlier. He'd helped with the legal work, the paperwork, the transfer of assets. He'd been, by all accounts, a supportive presence in her life during a difficult time. He was married, no children. His wife's name was a former art curator who now volunteered at the Met. When detectives contacted him, Thomas seemed surprised but cooperative. He confirmed that he'd visited periodically over the years, usually to discuss financial matters or family business. He said yes, he'd seen her 2 weeks ago. He said they'd had a disagreement about a trust fund her father had set up, something about distribution schedules and tax implications. He said it hadn't been a serious argument, just a difference of opinion. When asked about the visit 3 nights before her death, he paused. Then he said yes, he'd stopped by to apologize for the earlier disagreement. He said she'd seemed fine. He said he'd left around 11:00 p.m. and gone home. His wife confirmed he'd come home that night, though she couldn't say exactly what time. She'd been asleep. Thomas Carver didn't seem nervous, he seemed careful. The detail that fractured the initial narrative came from the medical examiner's full autopsy report, which was completed 6 days after the body was found. Carver had not drowned. The water in her lungs was minimal, consistent with passive immersion after death. Cause of death was listed as asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. There were deep bruises on both sides of her neck, thumb-shaped, consistent with pressure applied from the front, petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, fracture of the hyoid bone. The time of death was narrowed to between 8:30 p.m. and 10:00 p.m. on the night she disappeared. But there was something else, something that didn't fit the pattern of a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. Had been strangled, then carefully moved. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, no skin under her fingernails, no signs of a struggle. Toxicology came back clean, no alcohol, no drugs, no sedatives. Which meant either she'd been taken by surprise or she'd known her killer well enough not to fight back until it was too late. And then there was the matter of the river. The location where her body was found was not a place someone would randomly dump a corpse. It was secluded but accessible, hidden from the road but close enough to a parking area that someone could have backed a vehicle in under cover of darkness. It was deliberate. The killer had wanted her found, but not immediately. They'd wanted time. The pressure on the investigation came from two directions. From above, the department wanted a quick resolution. A young woman strangled and dumped in the river made for bad headlines, especially in a mayoral election year. The precinct captain, a man named who'd spent more time behind a desk than on the street for the past decade, made it clear that he wanted an arrest within 2 weeks. He didn't say it outright, but the message was obvious. Find someone who fits, build a case, and close it. From below, the detectives assigned to the case, Lydia and Michael Torrance, were being pulled in different directions by the evidence. A 12-year veteran with a reputation for being thorough and uncompromising thought the ex-boyfriend was the obvious choice. Had motive, opportunity, and no alibi. His story about the phone calls didn't make sense. Why would you call someone 3 times in 2 hours if you were just apologizing for an argument? Why not leave a voicemail? Why not send a text? Torrance, who'd been working homicide for 8 years and had a habit of trusting his instincts over statistics, wasn't convinced. He thought was too obvious. He thought the uncle was hiding something, but wanted results and had seniority, so they focused on. They brought in for a second interview on day 9. This time they put him in a room with no windows and let him sit for 40 minutes before, and Torrance walked in. Looked tired. He'd been drinking more, they could tell. His hands shook slightly when he reached for the water they offered him, asked him to walk through the night again, step by step. He did, same story. He'd left his apartment around 9, taken the subway home, gone to bed. They asked about the phone calls. He said he'd been worried. They asked what he'd been worried about. He said she'd seemed off lately, distant, like something was bothering her. They asked if she'd mentioned anyone threatening her. He said no. They asked if she'd mentioned Thomas Carver. He hesitated. Then he said yes, she'd mentioned her uncle once or twice, always in passing. He said she'd seemed uncomfortable talking about him. When pressed, said had once referred to her uncle as controlling. She'd said he'd been involved in her finances for years and she was trying to untangle herself from his oversight. And Torrance exchanged a glance. This was new. They asked why he hadn't mentioned this before. He said he didn't think it was relevant. He said he figured it was just family drama. They told him he could go. He asked if he was still a suspect. They didn't answer. The witness statements began to contradict each other in small but significant ways. Sandra had initially said she'd last seen at work on the day before her death, around 5:00 p.m., and that had seemed normal. But when detectives interviewed her a second time, Sandra mentioned something she'd forgotten. She said that earlier that week, on Monday, had received a phone call at work that seemed to upset her. Sandra had been walking past his cubicle and heard her say, "I told you, I'm not discussing this here." Then she'd hung up. Sandra hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now in retrospect it seemed significant. She said had looked shaken for the rest of the afternoon. The who'd seen at the wine bar was re-interviewed as well. This time, he remembered more. He said the woman had been with was older, maybe in her 50s, well-dressed with hair. He said they'd seemed tense, not like friends catching up, but like two people in the middle of a serious conversation. He said he'd gotten the impression that the other woman was doing most of the talking and was listening, her face pale. Detectives asked if he could identify the woman. He said no, he'd only seen her from a distance. But the description matched someone, Carver, Thomas Carver's wife. The timeline stopped making sense the more they looked at it. Had left work at 5:30 p.m. on the day she died. Her Metro card showed she'd swiped into the subway at 5:47 p.m. at the 50th Street station. She should have arrived at her apartment building by 6:30 p.m. But the doorman at her building, a man named, said he hadn't seen her come in that evening. He'd been on duty from 4:00 p.m. until midnight, and he was certain she hadn't entered through the front door. He knew by sight he would have noticed. Detectives checked to see if there was another entrance. There was a service entrance in the back that tenants used for deliveries and late-night access if they didn't want to bother the doorman. It didn't require a key, just a code. Would have known the code, so either she'd come in through the back or she'd never come home at all. Her phone records showed the last call she made was at 6:52 p.m. to a number that belonged to the personal trainer. It lasted 18 seconds, said she'd called to cancel their next session. He said she'd sounded rushed. He said that was the last time he heard from her. But her phone had pinged a cell tower near her apartment at 8:14 p.m. and then nothing. It either died or was turned off. If she'd been killed between 8:30 p.m. and 10:00 p.m., where had she been during those missing hours? And if she'd been home, why hadn't the doorman seen her? Thomas Carver became a figure people tried not to mention. When detectives began asking more pointed questions about him, they ran into resistance. His attorney, a sharp woman named, made it clear that her client had cooperated fully and would continue to do so, but only through appropriate legal channels. She said Thomas had no reason to harm his niece. She said the suggestion was baseless and offensive. Wen and Torrance, pushed to interview Carver, was present. Was polite, composed, and unhelpful. She confirmed that she'd had coffee with a few weeks earlier. She said it had been her idea, that she'd wanted to check in on her, see how she was doing. She said had seemed fine, maybe a little stressed about work. When asked if they'd discussed Thomas, said no, not really. When pressed, she said had mentioned something about wanting more independence, about feeling like her uncle had been too involved in her life for too long. Said she'd told that Thomas only wanted what was best for her. She said the conversation had been brief and amicable. Detectives asked where she'd been the night died. She said she'd been home all evening. She said Thomas had come home around 11:15 p.m. and they'd gone to bed. She said she was certain of the time because she'd been watching the news. But when detectives checked the news schedule for that night, the broadcast she claimed to have been watching had ended at 11:00 p.m. It was a small discrepancy. Maybe she'd misremembered, or maybe she was lying. Was not a killer. This became clearer the more time detectives spent with him. He was a man who drank too much and made poor decisions and fell into relationships with women who didn't particularly like him, but he wasn't violent. He had no history of assault, no complaints from previous girlfriends, no red flags in his background check. Wen and Torrance searched his apartment, they found nothing. No blood, no torn clothing, no signs that he disposed of evidence. His car, a 15-year-old Civic with a dented bumper, had been processed by the forensics team. Clean. His phone records showed he'd been at home the night died based on the cell tower pings. Unless he'd left his phone at home and driven to her apartment, killed her, and dumped her body in the river without his phone, he couldn't have done it. And even if he had, there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No DNA under nails. No fibers from his clothing on her body. No surveillance footage placing him anywhere near her building or the river that night. On day 14, they cut him loose. Didn't like it, but Torrance had been right. Was too obvious because he was innocent. But letting him go meant starting over and was running out of patience. The story held up better than it should have. Detectives obtained a warrant for his phone and discovered something interesting. The text messages between him and were more frequent than he'd initially admitted. Over the past 2 months, they'd exchanged over 60 messages, many of them late at night, many of them flirtatious. In one exchange had written, "I can't keep doing this." Had replied, "Then don't." She'd written, "You don't understand." He'd written, "So explain it to me." She never did. The last message she sent him was the morning of the day she died. It said, "I'm ending it tonight." Detectives asked what she'd meant. He said he didn't know. He said he'd assumed she was talking about a relationship, maybe the one with. They asked if he'd been having an affair with her. He admitted that yes, they'd slept together a few times, but it wasn't serious. They asked if his girlfriend knew. He said no. His girlfriend's name was Rachel, a dental hygienist who lived with him in his apartment in Hell's Kitchen. When detectives interviewed her, she confirmed that had been home the night died. She said he'd cooked dinner pasta with marinara sauce and they'd watched a movie. She said he hadn't left the apartment, but when pressed, she admitted she'd fallen asleep on the couch around 9:30 p.m. She didn't know when had come to bed. She'd woken up at 6:00 a.m. and he'd been there beside her. So he could have left, he would have had time. The mistake that cost her life might have been trusting someone she shouldn't have, or it might have been asking the wrong question. On day 17, received a call from a clerk at a law firm in Lower Manhattan. The clerk's name was, and she said she'd been following the news coverage of Carver's death. She said she'd worked with his uncle, Thomas Carver, on several occasions. She said she thought the detectives should know something. Thomas Carver had set up a trust fund for 11 years ago after her parents died. The fund was worth approximately $1.7 million, derived from life insurance policies and the sale of her parents' home. The fund was structured so that would receive quarterly distributions, but the principal remained under Thomas's control as trustee until turned 35 or until Thomas voluntarily relinquished control. Was supposed to gain full access to the money in 4 months. But according to Thomas had filed a petition 6 weeks before his death to extend his trusteeship for another 5 years, citing concerns about financial competence. The petition was still pending. Said she'd found it strange at the time because had always seemed perfectly competent. She said she'd mentioned it to a colleague and the colleague had said Thomas probably just wanted to keep control of the money. Hadn't thought much of it until she saw the news. Now she thought the detectives should look into it. The evidence that disappeared was subtle enough that no one noticed at first. His laptop had been seized from her apartment as part of the investigation. It was processed by the digital forensics team who extracted her emails, browser history, and documents. But when requested the full report on day 19, she noticed something odd. There were gaps. Emails from a 2-week period in early October were missing. The forensics tech, a young man named, said the files had been corrupted, possibly deleted before the laptop was seized. Asked if it was possible someone had remotely wiped the files. Said yes, it was possible, but he'd need to dig deeper to confirm. He never got the chance. The next morning, called in sick. The following day, he didn't show up for work. His supervisor said had submitted a resignation letter via email effective immediately. He said had cited personal reasons. When tried to reach him, his phone was disconnected. She drove to his apartment in Astoria. The landlord said had moved out over the weekend, paid the rest of his lease in cash and left no forwarding address. Reported it up the chain, said he'd look into it. He never did. The laptop was reassigned to another tech who confirmed the files were unrecoverable. The case moved forward without them. Fear and silence settled over the investigation like a fog. People stopped returning calls. Witnesses who'd been cooperative suddenly remembered nothing. Sandra requested a transfer to the company's Boston office and left New York 3 weeks after his death, stopped answering emails. The doorman told detectives he'd been mistaken. Maybe he had seen Cummins that night after all, he couldn't be sure. The neighbor who'd identified Thomas Carver called and said she wanted to recant her statement. She said she'd been confused, that the man she'd seen might not have been Thomas after all, that she'd been watching too much true crime TV and her imagination had gotten the better of her. Asked her if someone had pressured her. Said no, she'd just realized she'd made a mistake. Then she hung up, knew what was happening. Someone was cleaning up, someone with resources, someone who could make people disappear or change their minds. She brought her concerns to Torrance. He agreed. They went too. He told them to focus on the evidence they had, not the evidence they'd lost. He said the case was going cold, and cold cases didn't make the department look good. He suggested they might want to consider other possibilities. He mentioned again, said didn't do it, said prove it or move on. The alternative version of events went like this. Carver had discovered that her uncle, Thomas, had been embezzling from her trust fund for years. The missing emails, the ones that had been wiped from her laptop, contained correspondence with a forensic accountant she'd hired to audit the fund. The accountant had found discrepancies, withdrawals that didn't match the distribution schedule, transfers to offshore accounts, forged documents, had confronted Thomas. Maybe that was the argument had heard. Maybe that was why Thomas had visited her 3 nights before her death, not to apologize, but to convince her to stay quiet. Maybe he'd offered her money or threatened her or both. And when she'd refused, when she'd told him she was going to report him, he'd made a decision. He'd gone to her apartment on the night she died. She'd let him in because he was her uncle, because she trusted him, because she didn't think he was capable of violence. And he'd strangled her. Quickly, efficiently, someone who knew what he was doing. Then he'd put her body in his car. He drove a black sedan large enough to fit a body in the trunk and driven to the river. He dumped her in the water not far from shore, knowing she'd be found but not immediately. He'd gone home. His wife had covered for him, maybe because she knew, maybe because she didn't want to know. And then he'd made the evidence disappear. The emails, the witnesses, the forensic tech. Money can do that, money and fear. The motive was simple. Thomas Carver had stolen over $400,000 from his trust fund over the course of 10 years. He'd used it to cover debts, to fund investments that had gone bad, to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't otherwise afford. His law practice was struggling. His wife's family money had dried up. He'd been living beyond his means for years, and his trust fund had been his safety net, but had started asking questions. She'd noticed the discrepancies. She'd hired the accountant, and once she knew the truth, she'd become a liability. Thomas couldn't let her report him. He'd lose his law license. He'd face criminal charges. His reputation, his marriage, his life, everything would collapse. So he'd killed her, not in a rage, not in a moment of passion, but coldly, deliberately, because it was the only way to protect himself. And he'd nearly gotten away with it. He would have, if not for Torrance refusing to let it go. The truth was dangerous because it implicated people who didn't want to be implicated. When Torrance finally gathered enough evidence to bring charges against Thomas Carver, circumstantial, yes, but compelling, they were met with resistance from the district attorney's office. The DA, a man named Lawrence who'd been in office for 6 years and had political ambitions, said the case was weak. He said a good defense attorney would tear it apart. He said juries don't convict people like Thomas Carver on circumstantial evidence, especially when the victim's ex-boyfriend was a more obvious suspect. Argued that had been cleared. Said cleared wasn't the same as eliminated. He said unless they had physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, a witness, he wasn't going to prosecute. Asked what about the trust fund, the missing emails, the witness intimidation, said it was all circumstantial. He said they needed more, knew what he really meant. Thomas Carver had connections. He donated to last campaign. He knew judges, city council members, people who mattered. Prosecuting him would be messy, it would be expensive, and it might not end in a conviction. Better to let it go cold, better to let people forget. The consequences of the crime rippled outward in ways no one tracked. Started drinking more. He lost his job at the bar. Last anyone heard, he'd moved to Florida trying to start over. His relationship with Rachel ended. She'd found out about the affair with, and that had been the end of it. He still worked at the gym, training people who didn't know his name had been connected to a murder investigation. Moved out of her apartment 2 months after his death. She told her daughter she didn't feel safe there anymore. Sandra never came back from Boston. Thomas Carver continued practicing law, though he closed his office and began working from home. His wife stopped volunteering at the Met. They were seen less and less in public. The trust fund was quietly dissolved, the remaining money transferred to his brother in Oregon, who used it to pay off his mortgage and never spoke to the press. Was buried in a cemetery next to her parents. 40 people attended the funeral. Thomas Carver was not among them. What never made it into the official report was this. 3 weeks before died, she'd sent a letter to a law firm in Midtown requesting representation for a potential lawsuit against her uncle. The letter outlined her suspicions about the trust fund and included copies of financial statements she'd obtained. The law firm had never responded. When tracked down the attorney who would have received the letter, he said he had no record of it. He said it must have been lost in the mail or misfiled. He said it happened sometimes, didn't believe him, but she couldn't prove anything. There was also a storage unit, had rented it 4 months before her death, a small 10 by 10 space in the Bronx. When detectives finally located it and obtained a warrant, they found boxes of documents. Financial records, emails, handwritten notes. Everything had compiled in her investigation of her uncle. It should have been the smoking gun, but the storage unit had been broken into 2 days after her death. The lock had been cut and most of the documents were gone. What remained was useless fragments, copies of copies. Whoever had cleaned it out had known what they were looking for. The facility's security footage from that night was erased. Technical glitch, the manager said. The case officially went cold on day 63. Held a press conference and said the investigation was ongoing, but detectives had exhausted all immediate leads. He said they were hopeful new evidence would emerge. He said anyone with information should come forward. He thanked the public for their patience. And Torrance watched the press conference on a monitor in the precinct break room. Neither of them said anything. They both knew what it meant. Carver's murder would be filed away, added to the stack of unsolved cases that grew taller every year. The truth would remain buried not because it couldn't be found, but because too many people didn't want it found. Requested a transfer 6 months later. She said she needed a change. She ended up in Brooklyn working robbery. Torrance stayed in homicide. He still thinks about sometimes, about the way her hand had been reaching toward the shore, like she'd been trying to pull herself out of the water even after she was dead. He wonders if she knew, in those final moments, that no one would save her. The quiet, suffocating conclusion is that justice is not a guarantee. It's not even a probability. It's a luxury afforded to people whose deaths inconvenience the right people, whose killers lack the resources to cover their tracks, whose stories don't threaten anyone who matters. Carver's death was ruled a homicide, but no one was ever charged. The case remains open in the technical sense, but no detective has actively worked it in years. Thomas Carver is 73 now. He lives in a retirement community in Connecticut with his wife. They play bridge on Tuesdays. His brother still lives in Oregon. He has two daughters who never knew their aunt. Sometimes he thinks about calling the police, asking if there's been any progress, but he never does. He knows the answer. The world moved on, people forgot, became a statistic, a name in a database, a cautionary tale about women who live alone and trust the wrong people. But the truth is simpler and more brutal than that. Now, she trusted the right person, she trusted family, and family killed her. The final cold blow is this. Evil is not the monster in the alley. It's not the stranger with the knife. It's the uncle who bounces you on his knee when you're 6 years old. It's the man who helps you with your taxes and remembers your birthday and tells you he's proud of you. It's the person who knows where you hide your spare key and what time you come home from work and how much money you're worth dead. Evil wears a suit and a wedding ring. It pays its taxes and donates to charity and sleeps soundly at night because it has convinced itself that survival justifies anything. Carver died because she asked the wrong question, "Where did my money go?" And the answer killed her, not the words themselves, but the fact that someone couldn't afford to let her hear them. Somewhere in Connecticut, an old man waters his garden and thinks about his niece if he thinks about her at all. He tells himself it was necessary. He tells himself she would have understood. He tells himself he had no choice. And maybe in his own suffocating logic, he's right. Maybe that's the most terrifying thing of all, that people can justify anything, that murder can be rationalized, that the distance between love and violence is shorter than any of us want to believe. His body is in the ground. Her killer is playing bridge. And the rest of us go on living, pretending we're safe, pretending family means something, pretending that the people we trust won't be the ones who strangle us in the dark. But deep down, we know better. We've always known. We just don't like to say it aloud.